Is Dacia AM. Association with ESB on Waterford's WLR FM.
WLR FM.
Welcome back. A public meeting will take place at Lawler's Hotel in Dungarvan tonight, which will focus on parents, their children, and the pressures they face, particularly media pressure. Now, one of the speakers will be London-based journalist and author Joanna Boggle, who has written extensively on the subject, and she joins me now. Good morning, Joanna.
Good morning.
Is all of the media influence on our youngsters necessarily negative?
No, of course it isn't, and it is a bit of a cliche. I think we all say, oh, the television is so dreadful and the magazines are dreadful. Of course it isn't. I was just thinking this morning, actually, how very lonely and boring it must have been for generations of housewives if you were stuck alone in a house and you had no access to the news, if you didn't meet anybody else that day and if you didn't go out to work. I mean, I don't think one should underestimate the fun and the pleasure that radio and newspapers have brought into people's lives. In fact, especially, people in rural areas.
But on the negative side, what should parents be aware of?
I think one of the things we really have got to look at, apart from the all-pervasive influence of television, which is the biggest influence on all our lives, most people spend more time doing that than they do on any other activity except sleeping. Apart from that, I think it's worth looking at some of the influences that are specifically aimed at the young. And as a woman in particular, I'm extremely concerned about teenage magazines. The more so because a lot of parents, even parents of my generation who grew up in the 70s, and we ought to be more realistic, but we aren't, they have this naive idea, oh, it's all about face cream and fashion, and it isn't. There are some absolutely vile things in these magazines, and it's extremely important that parents know about this, and they simply ban them from the home. They say, no, I'm not going to subsidise that. I'm not going to put millions into publishers' pockets for this kind of filth.
What sort of things, Joanna, are targeted at what age groups?
Well, you're looking at the very young
Because
age.
I remember reading my sister's Jackie, and what was it, Dear Claire? It was all very...
Oh, yes. It's an older generation, they've got no idea. They all think it's Dear Claire and Jackie. Jackie's gone out of business. We're talking sadomasochism, lesbianism, perverted sex. I'm sorry, there are things that I don't even want to mention mid-morning on an ordinary family radio programme. And we're talking every issue of every magazine, titles like Minx, Just 17. These are the magazines that are aimed at the young teenage market. And the work that I've done, particularly in London, has shown that these are predominantly bought for or by younger teenage girls. I mean, they grow out of them at 16 or 17. They're aimed at 11,
Good God,
12,
what
13.
do they go on to?
Well, they can't. They're aiming at a young market. And what saddens me is that obviously, young people have a lot of spending power these days, and a lot of parents, they go around the supermarket and they want to buy something for their daughter. You see, they buy maybe a football magazine for the boy and something for dad, and drop in a magazine, and they don't read it. I mean, of course not. Life's busy. You don't read it. And at the back of your mind, you think, oh, it's like Jackie. Trust me, it isn't. In fact, don't trust me. Take a good look. And I think that teachers and parents, frankly, have to join together and say, just as you wouldn't let your children eat dirty food, you're not going to let their minds be spoiled. Just be realistic. Children need our support.
What if the publishers came back at you and said, well, we're just responding to market demand. It's out there, and, we're just reflecting that?
Oh, that's what they are saying. And in fact, they're saying worse, Joanna Boggle's a prude and all that. I don't think it's true. First, if there is a market demand, for instance, for glue sniffing, which there certainly was in the 80s, you have to say, well, we don't want children to destroy their bodies by snorting glue, and we will actually ban you from putting this substance that is susceptible to this kind of abuse. There may be a market demand for heroin. We're going to take control. And yes, there's a dark side to us all, and there may well be a market demand for teenage girls to sort of get all excited about some of this stuff. Well, I'm sorry. Has got to be changed.
It strikes me, is it just the women, the young girls who are being targeted in this way?
Extraordinarily, yes. Well, although it has to be said that girls read more than boys. They read earlier than boys, and they read more than boys right through their teenage years. So there's always been a market for girls' magazines that doesn't apply to boys. But one of the things that is really rather sinister is that whereas for boys there are some, you could loosely call hobby magazines, well, particularly sort of football and computer magazines and so on, that boys are more interested in a particular part of their lives. They have a particular hobby, and if that has a magazine attached to it, they might buy it. But for girls, there is this interest in the whole of life, in growing up, in the changes in their body, and they're getting interested in the opposite sex and so on, all of which is good and beautiful. But in the past, we encouraged girls to have a great sense of their value and of the beautiful things in life. So they had magazines which reflected that and reflected the whole of a girl's growing personality, the exciting possibilities for her career, for life, and indeed, yes, for marriage and children and cooking and eating and sewing, and none of that is now there. You're talking a sort of sort of horrible, hardcore stuff. And I got interested in this in the late 1970s when they began to change, and Jackie was a shining example of something different, but it went out, and all the magazines got much more crude and sexy, and what contraceptive are you using, and here's how to get your kicks in sex, and now they are
aimed at 13, 14 and 15-year-olds.
Oh, they'll older. They'll claim they're aimed at 15, 16 and 17. But
everybody swapped comics, so why don't they swap? I'm sure they're swapping these as well.
Of course. Yes, and also it's a sure way to get a 13-year-old to read something is to call it just 17. I mean, at least if I were a typical kid. And I think one has to say that it's really parents and teachers that have to take the first concern about this. You know, I don't think we should all flap our hands and say the government ought to do something. Certainly in Britain we have a useless pornography law, and it does allow the most filthy, obscene material. But let's start at the ordinary level. Let's start with you and me. Let's start with us and our responsibility one for another and for our children and so on.
What about television, Joanna?
Well, TV is, of course, at this stage of just absolutely massive change. I mean, I was brought up on independent TV and BBC, and you had a kind of common culture of Coronation Street and the other soap operas and the news, and everyone watched it.
And Top of the Pops.
And Top of the Pops. Now, all of that has changed, and some of the changes undoubtedly are good because more channels means more choice. In a way, it's healthier because just as we have lots of different publishers for books, so we should have lots of channels on television. But I have to say there is this incredible with violence, extreme violence, and again, very sexually explicit stuff. There's a particular problem with young people of the cartoons on Sunday morning, and you might think, oh, that's a lovely, easy way to keep the children
amused.
Quiet. Yes, but you look at these cartoons, they are very, very, very vicious and violent and crude in the sense
But they were always like that, Tom and Jerry.
No, this is not Tom and Jerry. This is not Tom and Jerry. This is horrible torture and sort of masochistic stuff, and people transforming themselves into evil monsters with razor claws that slice you up and the blood gunges. It's just horrible. And the other difficulty is there's no difference between good and bad. Usually there was a horrid monster who was sort of a baddie, and then there were the goodies who were often probably children, or they were smaller and weaker, but in some super way they banded together and they stamped out the bad.
And good always overcame evil.
Yeah, often in clever or funny ways that made you feel good about banding together and doing what... That's all gone. It's all gone. The evil guy is the clever guy, and he's monster powerful, and he will crush everything, and that's sort of exciting. And I think that's a...
So violence is one issue. What about the very overt sort of sexualization of many of these teenage soap operas?
Well...
Home and Away, for example.
Home and Away, and we've also seen it with Neighbours, which is a pity because some of these, well, particularly Neighbours, started with rather a good kind of plot, and the concept was quite good. And then people got a bit tired of it because it was a bit inane, and it got sexier and sexier, and this, I think, is a pity. I don't see why it is necessary to suggest that casual teenage sex is normal, natural, or good, or fulfilling, because it's none of these things, actually. Youngsters have a right to know that virginity is the normal state of a single person. Biologically speaking, it is normal. You are complete before you decide to marry, and if you don't marry, that's fine too. You don't need to have this sexual activity in order to give yourself permission to think you're grown up. In fact, it can often arrest your development, emotionally speaking. And I think that this message, especially for teenagers, is all wrong. What is being
so do mammies and daddies simply walk into the lounge or the sitting room or wherever this program is being viewed and switch it off?
Well, I think it's more all pervasive than that. With magazines, you can, I think, say, look, come on, we don't want to buy this, we don't want this in the house, and you can have a family feeling about that, and they get together and you can sort of block it. And incidentally, I think schools can do more about that too. You can have a partnership between parents and teenagers and teachers. Telly is harder. For one thing, it's so all pervasive, and many families have more than one television. They have one upstairs in the children's room, which incidentally I think is a very bad idea because I think it blocks the sort of...
No supervision,
and no talking about the programme afterwards, no laughing, and no togetherness. I mean, we need each other, we need to talk. So I think parents can say, look, let's switch this off. But I also think we've got to take a more mature attitude. We've got to be members of one another. I think you've got to write in and complain, and I mean complain. I don't mean to complain, or one of these days I'll complain. I mean, write that letter now, and make use of the complaints devices and lobby those in power to say we are allowed to have common values and standards, and it should be banned to have certain things before a certain hour in the day.
Joanna, unfortunately we're right up on time, but no doubt you'll have much more to say on this in Dungarvan tonight.
Indeed, I will.
Welcome to Ireland, and thank you very much for taking the call.
Thank you, I'm having a lovely time.
God bless. Goodbye.
Bye-bye.
That's Joanna Boggle, who has written extensively on that subject. She's a journalist and an author, and you heard her on Tuesday's Date AM. Hopefully we ask you always to be